One of the good things I think about the fact that you're all here already is that you're going to already know things about ELSA. Nonetheless, we did want to give you sort of a unified view so that we can all know that we're starting from the same place, make sure that everyone understands some of the fundamental components of what ELSA really is. So I'm going to go through this for you. ELSA is a really rich resource that we have to understand aging. And it's made up of a multidisciplinary cohort study that looks at a representative sample of people aged 50 plus living in private households in England. I like to underscore the private households because if you're very interested in things around aging that happens in institutional settings, you have to sort of potentially look elsewhere. But alongside this very multidisciplinary study that we have, we have an extensive amount of data that's been collected for a very long time. So this is the longitudinal component. So there was an initial pilot study back in 2001 to help clarify things, get it set up. And then in 2002, we started surveying the individuals and the respondents, following up every 2 years. Now, naturally, because this is a study about an aging cohort, as time has gone on, we've had to introduce these refreshment samples periodically to make sure that our cohort remains representative of those aged 50 plus. As I've already highlighted, I mean, ELSA, the great thing about why you're here is hopefully because you're interested in learning more about the data so that you can start using it, because it really is a very rich resource of information to look at aging. The key objective here is really to understand these complex processes that happen over the aging process and what that means for individuals. In order to understand these complex dynamics that happen, we have to have information across several different domains, and I'll show you a bit more detail of that later. But really, we're taking into account questions around the economic circumstances of people, things around their employment, understanding their social relationships and connections. We've got information down on a biological level, so we can understand those kinds of mechanisms, as well as bigger questions around health and well-being. And the reason, the reason we've got all of these different components, again, on the one hand, it's because aging is a complex process. It's also a dynamic process. So for us to understand any aspect that we're interested in, we need all of this information. This really allows us to do advanced research. There's plenty of evidence already out there that's used ELSA, bringing forward this advanced research from the data. But also, I think my background is coming from working in sort of third sector policy. That's why we want to understand these things from a research perspective so that we can help policy be developed in a better way to enhance the lives of people as they age. I've mentioned that that this is very multidisciplinary as a study, so there are several different modules and components that make up ELSA. And I wanted to start by highlighting what I, for myself at least, tend to think of as the main ELSA study, okay? So our the core of ELSA really is made up of this computer-assisted personal interview that takes place with respondents, and that collects a wide range of data. We also have this self-completion questionnaire component. And the self-completion questionnaire is interesting. It doesn't cover everyone, but it's a very large proportion of the main sample. But because it's self-completion, it allows some more sensitive questions to be asked. It allows people to perhaps even have more time to think about their responses. For example, how many friends do you have? I mean, that might take you some time to think about. And so this allows us to think and gather information that's a bit more on that sort of personal level. In that spirit, it's worth noting that in waves 6 and 8, which I'll show you the years next, In wave 6 and 8, there were special self-completion components looking at sexual activity and sexual behavior. Again, I think ELSA is really innovative in pushing forward this notion that sexual activity doesn't stop when you turn 50. Alongside that self-reported information and that interview-guided information gathering, we also have a nurse visit that's been conducted periodically, where trained nursing professionals take various measurements of physical function, including some blood samples that then lead to some other things I will highlight. So this table just gives you an overview of where we've been so far. So I'll start at the end with wave 10, which field work is, I think it's been completed. And there are some other plans, other sort of data collection components that come after that. We've got already wave 11 planning. There's the healthy cognitive aging protocol project that I'll talk about. That's just starting its second wave. But here you see that we've got, starting from 2002, and essentially every 2 years, on track and very regularly collecting this data. The only interruption, as you might expect, happened with COVID. But instead of having wave 10 just happen in this unusual circumstance, we actually did specific COVID studies, 2 points of data collection during the pandemic. But you'll see here we've got the different regular CAPI, the computer-assisted personal interviews that take place, and then you can see where the nurse visits occur. This here is where there was a split between the nurse visits, so 50% got their nurse visit in wave 8, and the other half of the cohort got it at wave 9. You can see some of the sample numbers there, and then you can see where we've done refreshments to the study, like I said earlier, to keep it representative. And then wave 3, we also had a life history component where people gave retrospective, answered things retrospectively about their entire life course and life history. So here are the some of the main areas of information that we collect in ELSA. So, of course, you're going to have your basic demographic data, which is necessary. Lots of stuff around physical health, and this includes questions around mobility and limitations in mobility, the presence of chronic conditions, the sense of disability, lifestyle practices. This is what I like to use instead of calling it healthy behaviors. But lifestyle practices like smoking, the nature of sleep quality, things like that. A lot of questions of mental health and psychosocial well-being, and I put here to note that some of these, of course, are collected in the self-completion questionnaire rather than the interview. Questions on social care that some of which were first introduced with wave 6, so it's not necessarily going all the way back to 2002. Some questions around social participation, financial information around employment, the nature of pensions, how much people get. We've got really rich financial data, and you'll hear more about that from Zoe from the Institute for Fiscal Studies after me. Questions around housing, cognitive function, which for most of the ELSA survey, we have some sort of what I would consider basic questions around cognitive function, like getting immediate word recall, delayed word recall. But there is a component that's been a bit more focused looking at cognition that you'll hear about. Questions on volunteering and caregiving, which relate, of course, back to social participation. So understanding how those dynamics work, understanding with the volunteering and caregiving how people feel about what they're doing. Do they feel recognized and rewarded? Does it feel demanding? And then some questions around expectations, which I think might be a little perhaps underused, I might say that, but these are people's expectations of how long they'll live or what age they'll think they'll retire and things like that, which just give you a sense of where people consider themselves in the sort of bigger picture of their own personal aging. I've mentioned these already, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about them. We've got these very special sub-studies that have also been conducted as part of ELSA that enrich to a greater detail or in additional ways the kinds of information we have in the main survey. So I mentioned wave 3 collected a life history interviews. These are retrospective concepts. I've in the past used this to understand people's histories with respect to housing, for example, because you have people tell you when they moved into a home, and so you can understand when they moved into their first home, and then when they moved, and you understand those dynamics over their entire life course. And I believe we've got a second wave, or a second, maybe not wave, but a second version of the life history about to be collected in the next year or so, I think it is. We've got people here who work in the audience, who work for the Healthy Cognitive Aging Protocol. This is something that started back in 2018 with ELSA, and it's linked also to efforts related to the health and retirement study out of the US and the big family that you'll hear about today, to ensure that we're getting, on the one hand, consistent measurements of cognition across the world so that we can understand dementia risk and changes in cognitive function. But again, this is a very rich and robust way of looking at cognition that's not as simple as word recall or some of the other measures that we've seen used in the past. This is a series of questions and batteries that allow us to create this predictive algorithm for the whole ELSA data set to categorize them according to different levels of cognitive function. And then finally, the COVID-19 sub-study that I've been, up until recently, focused on using, which had primarily through online delivery of the survey, as well as computer-assisted telephone interviews, questions. Not everything that we have in the main ELSA survey, but a lot, as well as very specific questions pertinent to the COVID context. So things around feeling symptoms of disease, the questions around self-isolation, furlough from work, and those sorts of things. And then finally, just to highlight some of the more opportunities for some more advanced work that can be done through various linkages and some projects that are in the pipeline or sort of just getting started up in terms of pushing our ability to analyze some of the data that we've already collected. We have linkages to hospital episode statistics, so this is part of a NHS, my understanding is this is a part of an NHS data set of all of the records and things that are put together. We can link that to our respondents in the ELSA data set to know their interactions with the healthcare system. We also have this new linkage to environmental data, and as an example of that, we know the levels of air pollution in the place where each respondent lives. I think there's some other kinds of environmental data that are part of that kind of linkage. Through the collection of samples via the nurse visits and ongoing through the ELSA study, we've got information about genetic data. Researchers have worked on developing these genotyping the data and creating these polygenic scores that can be examined to look at the relationship between genes and other health outcomes. We have biomarkers, a whole range of biomarkers that are collected, and something that's being put forward now is work on this proteomics. So this is understanding sort of profiles and assays of the protein biomarkers that we've gathered. So one of the things, the existing samples that we've got allow us to do this to a certain degree, and in the future we'll be taking a new approach so that we can do even more advanced proteomic stuff. So for any of you out there who work with more of this biological interface with aging and health, that could be very useful. Thanks. I've got the link here to the website where you can find more information, lots of videos that we have from previous user days and other things that you might find beneficial to view. And before we go to Zoe, who's going to tell us about some of the derived variables and those special financial derived variables, Are there any questions for me about ELSA? Was it too simple? Did you all know this already? Yeah.
Just get a copy of the slides.
Absolutely, yeah.
Was the nurse visit done again at Wave 10?
I don't think so. I think it's going to be done with Wave 11.
I just have a simple question. What is the reason the numbers of sample sizes decrease? Is that because they are bad or they used to participate?
It's going to be a mixture of both. There is a certain degree of attrition that will happen because of mortality, but there is also just drop-off or people who don't respond. We do collect information that we call end of life, like a special end of life survey, where when we know that a respondent has died, we will interview their partner or some proxy person to get a sense of what happened to them and understand a little bit around their sort of progression to death.
And that they dropped out, we know the reason of the
If it's been, now we will be able to identify in lots of cases, perhaps not 100%, whether someone has moved into an institution or whether they've died. If they just stop participating, then we won't know anything about their reasons for drop-off. But addressing that is part of the process with the refreshment sample. So not only does the refreshment sample make sure we're getting people aged 50 to 52, because just the aging means that we're moving up, we're also making sure that the distribution across the ages reflects available census data and what we know about the population.
It's also true to say that officially, that not just ELSA, but lots of surveys is getting worse over time. It's kind of like a well-known problem that everyone's struggling with. So I don't think we're unusual in that.
Yeah. And we were very lucky, we think, with the COVID-19 study that we had a very high response rate of our cohort that we reached out to. So it was very high. It was 75 or 76%. And then longitudinally, so for the 2 waves, it was above 95. So we have most of the respondents actually gave us the information at both of the COVID waves. Yeah.
So we do have in ELSA surveys, right?
Yes.
So they can explain the missingness that we can find from either not responding to the next visit or why they didn't respond to the previous ways, right?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So we there is a research behind this, but
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for raising that. You can find a good video on our website explaining the weights and that, because we do have weights included with the survey that allow you to ensure adjusted representativeness when you do cross-sectional, that allows you to adjust for the longitudinal component and things like that. So several different weights are included in the survey that you can use depending on your type of analysis.
what's the average attrition between
The average attrition, I mean, this gives you a sense of it. So you're going, we had a big sample there at the beginning that went down, but then with our refreshment, we're bringing it back up. And so the number of attrition, I don't know off the top of my head.
They want people to come out and miss a wave and then come back the next wave. So it's not like once they drop out one wave, we don't push them. I think they have to hard refuse, say no, I'm never come across my doorstep ever again. If we just can't contact them, we will go back to them the next wave until we really find people from them.
Yeah. And you do see people in the data set that are missing at a wave, but are present for many waves.